Welcome to the Diplomatic Webture series conducted by the Department of Political Science in association with VK Krishna Menon Center. So today we are going to listen to a webture by Ambassador Deepa Gopal and Wadhwa on India's relationship with Japan, India's trustworthy friend. Japan and India signed a peace treaty and established diplomatic relations in 1952. In 2007, India and Japan concluded a strategic agreement which is hailed as an essential pillar for the future architecture of security of Asia. Japan and India are reliable partners in peace with a common interest in and complementary responsibility for promoting the security, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. The two countries have also signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement too. No wonder their ties are described as Asia's fastest growing relationship. Albeit, there existed incompatibilities in their foreign policy stances. Earlier, Japan was closely aligned with the United States, while India remained formally non-aligned or more aligned to the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, India maintained a closed economy in contrast to Japan's relatively open export-led economic policy. But since 1990s, however, there has been a renaissance in relations between Japan and India, and with New Delhi's post-Cold War economic liberalization policies, India has become a new market for Japan. China's aggressive outlook in territorial disputes and the successful Quad Summit make the partnership unique and strong and more security-oriented. Today we have Ambassador Deepa Gopal and Wadhwa as our guest speaker to reflect on India's relations with Japan. And Ambassador Deepa Wadhwa is a distinguished career diplomat who served in the Indian Foreign Service for 37 years. Long time period, right? In fact, she was the first Indian women ambassador to Japan. She has also been India's ambassador to Qatar, to Sweden, to Latvia, and Republic of Marshall Islands. She served twice in China and had stints in Switzerland and Netherlands. She was instrumental in the active promotion of India's economic diplomacy in areas of trade, technology, investments, and energy security. As Joint Secretary of Ministry of External Affairs, she was in charge of the United Nations and its agencies like UNICEF, ILO, UNDP, WHO, etc. in India. And as a Malayali, we can be more proud of her. She is also Malayali, and her husband is Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, who was our previous speaker. Today we are going to listen to her. A warm welcome to you to this webture, ma'am.
Thank you very much for calling me and inviting me here. You know, it is very special for me as a Malayali to be talking to an audience that is predominantly from Kerala and Kerala University. I should tell you that I'm a typical Malayali who always yearns for Kerala but has never lived there. You know, there is this Pravasi Malayali. I'm one of those, always lived outside Kerala, grew up outside Kerala, but my primary identity is Malayali, and I'm extremely happy to be able to talk to an audience that is from Kerala University, about many experiences in my career. And thank you, Professor Girish Kumar, for going over my career. As you said, that I was the first woman ambassador to Japan. Being the first woman ambassador was not very difficult because, as in the course of the Foreign Service, in the course of the... Is there some... can you hear me? I think there's somebody who's talking. So, in the course of as the Foreign Service evolved, the thing was that, women started coming into the service, and then we had these positions. So it wasn't because of any, sort of importance of myself that I was in Japan, excepting that I had specialized in East Asia. So in the Foreign Service, and I know young people are listening, and I'm talking about the Foreign Service a little bit because I hope some of you will aspire to join the Foreign Service. And my specialization was East Asia. I learned Mandarin, I learned Chinese, and then I specialized in that particular area, which is how I landed up as ambassador in Japan. And I must say, when I went there, I did not really myself appreciate as much the importance of this relationship. I heard Professor Girish calling it, one of our most reliable partners, and he said that it was the fastest growing relationship. All of this is very true. It is a very, very special relationship, and I think one of our greatest foreign policy successes, if I may say so. Before I start off, what I want to do today is really talk about the our policy towards Japan, our bilateral relations as it stands now, and with a little bit of a futuristic, perspective. But I will also briefly touch on the past so that one gets a complete understanding of, where this relationship is and why it is where it is. So permit me to go a little back into time, and then I will talk about the present, and I will talk a little bit about the future and the different aspects of this relationship which will continue to get refined. So to begin with, if you think of India and Japan, they're so far away from each other, other ends of Asia. And as I heard Professor Sajjad said, very few people know much about Japan, honestly, and this was perhaps true about us also. We all know about China because this large neighbor that we've had, our kind of troubled relationship. We also know about the cultural connections between India and China because Buddhism went from here. We have the famous Bodhidharma who went from Kerala, perhaps all the way, to China. We don't know so much about Japan. So one thing about Japan, again, is that, of course, there is a great cultural connect that both sides are not very conscious about. And this is the Buddhist Connect. So we had, like Bodhidharma, there was a Bodhisena who was there in Japan in the 8th century. But before that, by the 6th century, Buddhism had already gone via China to Japan. I won't talk too much about it, except to say that any one of you who travels in Japan, you will be quite amazed at there's so many common civilizational markers between the two countries. And this is not only religion, a lot of beliefs that we have. This somehow is the basis of the relationship. Maybe it came via Buddhism, but I used to say it was very common in some ways with us in Kerala. For example, Shintoism has a lot of belief in the ancestor worship, respect to ancestors, which is very much part of the Kerala tradition. And so there were many, besides the religious itself, but there were also cultural commonalities between us. So there was a general positive perception, certainly in Japan, about India. India perhaps knew less about Japan till the beginning of maybe post the World War II. At least at the common level. So this is one marker in our relationship. The other thing that I suppose the other contact between the two of us was really the European mercantile, the mercantilists like the Dutch and the Portuguese. They came to Kerala. They also went to Japan. They traded with India, with Gujarat, with Kerala, with India and Japan. And this is where you have some kind of, proof of the contacts between our two countries, which go back to about the 16th century. Thereafter, actually, when you read anything about India and Japan, you have to come to post the Meiji Reformation, which was in the late 19th century, when Japan opened up to the world, and they opened up to India, which at that point of time was part, of course, of the British Empire. And their connections, the shipping lines started, trade started between the two countries. And in the early part of the 19th century, there was this feeling of pan-Asianism. And you find, India's, in some way, our Indian independence movement, quite inspired by Japan's victory over Russia in a major war, which was, I think, in 1903. And we felt that if Asian powers could stand up to the Caucasian powers, there was hope for us, colonized countries. I just want to put this in perspective. I will not belabor this, but I'm sure you all will know, and people who are interested do read about the pre-World War period. Raj Bihari Bose, who was there in Japan, our Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose himself, who was there in Japan, and the Japanese during the Second World War, they came up to our northeast. They came to Manipur and Nagaland, never really came into India. And, they very often believe that it is because of the INA and those famous Delhi, the Delhi trials, that the British were forced to leave India, and therefore they did have a role to play in the independence of India. That is a whole other story, and I'm sure some young students might like to, study further on this or research further on this. But I'm going to now move quickly to post-World War II. Post-World War II, again, there have been some very interesting markers in our relationship. In the early years of our relationship after World War II, when Japan was completely, sort of isolated, was kind of treated as a pariah because of World War II among nations. India and Pandit Nehru at that point of time looked on Japan as an Asian brother. It's very interesting that while it was still under occupation, that was in 1947, that Pandit Nehru invited Japan to the Asian Relations Conference. Again, in 1952, what happened was there was this famous San Francisco conference where all the countries that had suffered because of Japan's actions in the World War, in the Second World War, they got together and started demanding, reparation from Japan. India did not even attend the conference. In fact, we signed a separate treaty establishing diplomatic relations. And that is what Professor Girish Kumar just talked about, which was a 1952 treaty. And we are now going to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the signing of that treaty and the establishment of diplomatic relations. The Japanese perception of us was that we didn't join the rest of the world in condemning them. And how did they reciprocate? Very early in the relationship, we became the first recipients of development aid from Japan. As early as 1957, 1958, when the famous Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, whom we all, I think, in India know a lot about, is a friend of India, his grandfather came to India at the invitation of Pandit Nehru, and he offered us development aid. I mentioned this because this has become a very, very important part of our relationship. I call it the ballast of our relationship. In the areas where, nothing much was happening in the political sphere or the strategic sphere, from perhaps 60 to almost 2000, I would say, almost 40 years, what did continue and which was very strong was the development cooperation, the development aid that we received from Japan, and we continue to receive now. And, they played a very, very important role in the development of infrastructure and so on in our country. But the turn in the relations really happened in 2000. Now, starting from there, I'm really going to come to the present day. Just wanted to give you a sort of a background of how we came to 2000. The political relations in probably in the 50s were quite close. We had frequent visits. Between 60 and 2000, what happened really was, as I think has been mentioned, that we were in different camps during the Cold War. They were very closely aligned to the US. We were non-aligned, seen as closer to the erstwhile USSR. And therefore, it was a kind of a relationship of benign status. I mean, we had no baggages of differences, of conflict or anything. But on the other hand, the only thing that really kept us going was development cooperation. And perhaps, importantly, at some point of time in the early 80s, the Suzuki Corporation that came to India. I'll keep some of these markers, and I would love to hear questions from the students. When I say Suzuki, or I talk about some of these, these concepts or these ideas that hit you when you think of Japan, ask me questions on that, and maybe I will be able to talk and elaborate further on them. So now to come to what has been happening since the 2000s. So the India-Japan relationship has rapidly matured in the 2 decades of this century to become one of the most consequential relations of Asia, and perhaps in the world, and certainly the extended remit of the Indo-Pacific. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who is, as I mentioned, is one of the principal architects of the relationship, had always maintained that, and I quote him, he says, "A strong India was in the best interest of Japan, and a strong Japan in the best interest of India." This convergence of interests is not limited to the bilateral, but also to the chain security environment and the balance of power consequent to the rise of China. Prime Minister Modi, who decided after he was elected in 2014 that Japan would be the first country outside of South Asia that he would visit, and I happened to be the ambassador there at the time that he came, his vision of the relationship was in 2014, which he said was that he believed this relationship would, again I quote, exercise a profound influence in shaping the course of Asia and our interlinked ocean regions. These 2 statements explain the rationale of the India-Japan Special Strategic and Global Partnership. Now, in diplomacy, these are very often words, it seems, but they have certain gravitas, they have certain special meaning. And I will tell you why that is. So what is this Special Strategic and Global Partnership about? It is supported by, I would say, 4 pillars. First is common values and practices as democracies. The second is a converging perceptions of threats to the regional security environment. And the third, I think a lot of you will be interested in, is the self-evident complementarities of respective economic strengths and needs of our two countries. And fourth is the shared aspirations of both to have a greater role in this and say in international affairs as two of the largest economies in the world. I think Japan now stands at number 3, and I mean, soon we will overtake them. So we are two major economies of the world, and we therefore believe that we need to have a greater say in international affairs. Additional factors which are there, which sustain this relationship, are what I mentioned, I think. One is, a lot of goodwill on both sides. I mean, I've seen this in Japan more than I've seen it anywhere. And interestingly, bipartisan political support in both countries. What do I mean by saying bipartisan political support? Because when we started this great sort of the new phase of our relationship with Japan, it was led by, we had an NDA government. It was Prime Minister Vajpayee. Thereafter, we had Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and then now again we have UPA. Similarly, in what happened in Japan was it was the LDP. There was the Prime Minister Mori. LDP has been the major party in Japan, which has ruled for most of the years. But there was an interregnum when they lost power to something called the DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan. And even during that phase, the importance given to the India relationship remained unchanged in Japan, which is why I say it's very strong, because all political parties across the entire spectrum in both countries believe in the importance of this relationship, and this gives it a certain amount of strength. Then, of course, another aspect is our growing relations, both our growing relations with America, the US, which has been an alliance partner of Japan, and our own growing relationship with the US. The other factor is the unrelenting, aggressive Chinese actions, the assertiveness of China, which threatens the territorial integrity of both countries. Both of us are threatened. We, as you know, along the Himalayas and their presence in the Indian Ocean, and they, with the problems that they're having over the Senkaku Islands dispute in the East China Sea, and the Japanese expansion in the South China Sea. And, we again have come around post-COVID. There have been certain new aspects to this relationship. And this has been the realization of the need to retool existing supply chains to reduce dependence on China. And what has this really, this has led to the institutionalization of the Quad. I'll come to the Quad later, in which both are stakeholders, and which seeks to offer an alternate option for a peaceful, prosperous, open, inclusive, law-based regional order. Now, to promote cooperation and understanding in political, strategic and security, economic and cultural fields, there already exists between India and Japan a very comprehensive, multi-layered architecture of dialogue in place. Now, at the apogee, right at the top, you have prime ministerial annual summits. Now, I have to tell you that India has these annual summits at the prime ministerial level, at the head of government level, only with two countries. One is Russia, it's an old partner of ours, and the other is Japan. Japan has this institution that our prime ministers meet every year, annual summits only with India. And I think this gives a certain strength to the relationship, because every time the prime ministers meet, they used to meet every year before COVID. What would happen was we would review the relationship, say, where should we go? How can we deepen it? What are the areas we should widen this to? So it's a very, very important institutional structure, which helps the bilateral relationship. Besides this, we have 2+2 defense and foreign ministerial dialogue. Between the two, it's called the 2+2, and ministerial and official interactions across just across the field. I mean, you could foreign minister, defense minister, energy ministers, commerce ministers, finance ministers. So there is this very, very, very multi-layered architecture of contacts, not only at the ministerial levels, at the official levels, and covering almost every conceivable field that you can think of, including issues such as an NSA's dialogue that we have. We have also, we have a lot of contacts between our defense services, and I will come to that later. Now, what happens is this institutionalization of dialogue lends structure. As I mentioned, it also ensures that there's periodicity and there's dynamic content to the relationship. though this, as I said, this has been affected, this bilateral our summits, in the 70th, they were very hopeful that the new Prime Minister, whom we have, Fumio Kishida, will visit India. I think both sides are hoping for this visit. And even after Prime Minister Abe stepped down, a lot of people said, oh, Prime Minister Abe was responsible for the closeness of the relationship. As I said, there is bipartisan support. And even Prime Minister Suga, I think, though he could not visit in that short 1 year, there were several telephone conversations and meetings wherever they could, for example, during the virtual Quad Summit and so on. So, both countries have been very committed to keep up this momentum in the relationship. And the 70th anniversary, I think we're going to see a lot more of activities. And now that we are in this COVID pandemic, and we're still, going through the third or fourth or whatever wave it is, I think one should talk a little bit about what has happened. I think this has certainly seminally changed the world. It has affected personal destinies. It has affected the global economic order. It has affected politics between countries. And it has brought into focus issues such as the resilience of global supply chains, access to health-related global goods, and also the importance of digitization, innovation, etc., where, India has some strengths. In the context of India-Japan relations, the pandemic has provided further opportunities for cooperation. As Japan launched a $2.2 billion US dollar billion fund for supply chain diversification, as they called it, to help Japanese companies in China to diversify, to reshore, to move back to Japan and shift production lines also to the ASEAN, India, and Bangladesh. This has coincided with our own government's Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. And, there are apparent synergies which we will have to follow up on. I think there are possibilities, let me say. The Japan Bank for International Cooperation, now this is one of its arms of international cooperation called JBIC, has entered into loan agreements of about 2 billion with the State Bank of India in these recent months to help Japanese companies which are there in India, especially in the automotive sector. And also they have helped a lot with, with vaccines and different kinds of support specifically to do with the COVID pandemic. Japan has also proposed a trilateral, something called the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, SCRI, along with Australia. And the three ministers have met, and we're looking at how we can develop this. Of course, as you can see, all of this is to ensure that we are not vulnerable to over-dependence on China for production and supply chains, and that we should somehow build resilience to exogenous and sort of unanticipated shocks which came our way after the pandemic. In addition, under the Quad, as you must have heard, again in the context of the pandemic, there is a COVID vaccine initiative where basically India will manufacture and Japan will fund. Australia will help in the I think the logistics to make sure it reaches all the Indo-Pacific countries. But I will come to that later. So what are India's, when you look at India foreign policy, and I suppose a lot of you work on this, so what do we look at as priorities of India's foreign policy? And these would be security, economic development, and a global role commensurate with its size and contributions, which I mentioned earlier. And here there's very clear synergies with Japan's own interests and priorities. As the political relationship, I told you, is fairly well secured and has a supporting framework, we have to look at what are the areas as we go forward that can bring the maximum benefit to us. And I think in this, very importantly, the deepening of bilateral security and defense ties is right at the top. And in addition to that, of course, is the economic relationship. And when you look at the economic relationship, I think it is investments in modernizing the infrastructure of India, including development of the Northeast and strategic connectivity to the neighboring areas, that is the ASEAN and the countries bordering the Northeast, and also enhanced Japanese FDI into important industries in India, which caters both to the domestic market and also helps India to become an important part of the global supply chains. What do I mean by that? That we will be able to manufacture in India with Japanese FDI and be able to export. As of now, there are about 1,440 odd Japanese companies in India, and of them, about 40% of them, they only focus on the Indian market. And the rest are exporting, but it is not really as much as they could be. The potential is much more than what is happening. And the other part, I think, of the importance of the relationship as we go forward really is collaboration in frontier technologies, because everybody knows that, the future is going to be determined by advanced technologies. So where are the areas where we can bring our strengths together and work? Now, quickly, I will go through each one of these, starting with security and defense ties. Strategic convergence between India and Japan has been a strong driver of the partnership in this century, as the regional security environment deteriorated primarily due to the rise of China. And also in our immediate neighborhood, India's problem with Pakistan, Japan's problem not only with China, but also with North Korea. North Korea with its missile program, with its nuclear, with its nuclear capabilities, so has been, our immediate neighborhoods certainly have seen a deterioration in our security environments. Bilaterally, the convergence has been manifest in a steady accretion in defense and security ties, which began with almost nothing in 2008, where we signed a joint declaration on security cooperation. And this has matured hugely, because as we talk now, we have recently signed something called AXA, which is a logistics agreement. That was the latest in the series of defense agreements that we have signed, which was signed in 2020. But besides that, all our three arms of the military, we conduct bilateral exercises. We also join together in multilateral exercises or plurilateral exercises, such as the Malabar, where, Japan, US, it used to be a US, India exercise, but Japan has joined as a regular member, and now we have Australia also. The Coast Guards exercise together. What does all this mean? This means that this defense cooperation has reached a certain maturity, which I think none of us could anticipate, which tells you a lot about the importance of the relationship between our two countries in terms of our respective security environments. These exchanges, of course, also have the possibility of what can we do in cooperating not only in sale of technologies, but development of technologies. And here it's been a little slow. We have the agreements in place, but I think this is one area of great potential where we can look at key technologies to develop together, key technologies that we can produce together also. Japan and India also discuss security cooperation, not only in the bilateral context, but also in trilateral mechanisms. So we have a Japan, Australia, India trilateral. We have a Japan, US, India trilateral. And we have the Quad, where in all of these, we talk about security issues. There is no doubt that I think, we are seeing Japan perhaps talk up, at least speak up more about India's own security concerns. And here I would like to tell you about two instances. One was initially it was very difficult to get Japan to talk about and criticize or talk in the terms that we would like about the threat that we face on terrorism, from state-sponsored terrorism from Pakistan. But I think Japan itself has now started realizing, after a few experiences where, it had Japanese nationals killed in Algeria and so on, the importance of terrorism, and so has been more forthcoming now in understanding what our concerns are. This is one area. And second is, of course, the Chinese, the threats in the Ladakh area. We have found that Japan has been more forthcoming in their statements in which they talk about the need for not changing status quo using force. And, this is a mantra that they use. And so, they have been more forthcoming than they have been in the past. This basically is the framework of our security and defense cooperation. And beyond the bilateral, beyond the issues that we face, I think we are looking at the larger Indo-Pacific and having common partners, as it were, to ensure the peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean, which is of extreme importance not only to India, but also to Japan, because Japan is so dependent on for its energy security on oil imports, and most of it passes through the Indian Ocean, and therefore the security of the Indian Ocean is as important to Japan as it is to India. The next subject that I'd like to talk about, the next topic, would be cooperation in infrastructure development. I think I mentioned this because this is something I think very few people really realize, the importance that Japan as a partner has played in India's infrastructure development. Japan has been extending development assistance to India, as I mentioned, since the late 50s, 1958, and is today's India's leading bilateral donor with a cumulative ODA, official development assistance, ODA, of 56 billion. And it is likely to be our largest donor. We also, in terms of recipient countries, we are number one as far as Japan is concerned. It used to be China and it used to be Vietnam, but it has moved to India. So this has also been a very important, I think, perhaps a development in our relationship, where they have, they were really responsible very much. Japan was very responsible for the development of infrastructure, for the economic development of China as we know it now. They went into China in the early 90s, and I think very, very major projects in China were because of Japan. They continue to have a very major presence in China of about 35,000 companies there as compared to ours. But that role that they played in the development of China, we hope that they will play in the development of India. So Japanese development cooperation assistance in India stands apart for important reasons. The first is that it is directed to national areas of priority and fulfills India's nationally determined needs such as infrastructure upgradation. The second is that it's just a large scope and the scale of the projects. We have a lot of ODA partners, a lot of countries in the West also, but these are small sort of small projects which can be upscaled if required. But in the case of Japan, these are huge projects which are transformative in nature. And what are the examples of this? You all must have heard of what is called the Western Dedicated Freight Corridor. It runs from Haryana to Mumbai, and it aims to decongest, and please do listen to this, 70% of India's rail freight network. And it drastically shortens the time of, say, movement of goods from Delhi to Mumbai from weeks to days. The freight corridor is kind of the spine of the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, said to be one of the world's largest infrastructure projects with an estimated outlay of $100 billion. Planned with 8 new smart cities which cover 7 states. This is what I mean. The scale is huge and they really have the potential to transform India's economy. There is also the Chennai-Bangalore Industrial Corridor, which will upgrade infrastructure along the route linking several industrial zones between Bangalore, and actually it ends in Andhra Pradesh. And then there are several metro projects in many cities of India. The third is that, and of course, the high-speed rail project, I should not forget that, which perhaps is going to be a flagship in India. Let's see, how it will transform rail travel in India. The third is the terms of loans, which cannot be matched by any global lending institutions. An example being this, the Ahmedabad, the high-speed rail, which I just mentioned. It was a loan of $12 billion, and it carries an interest rate of only 0.1% with a repayment period of 50 years and a 15-year moratorium. Now, perhaps you all will wonder, why is Japan so generous? Nobody comes forward just based on altruism. So why is this? The benefit to Japan is that this project will require procurement from Japan of rolling stock, signaling, telecommunication equipment. It will benefit Japanese companies, and it will also advance Japan's promotion. They want to promote the export of infrastructure projects and systems to revitalize their own economies. So, this is actually win-win for both countries. Again, when you go back to infrastructure, the cooperation infrastructure, a very important thing on the Indian side, why we welcome the Japanese in this area, is the trust factor. Japan is really our trusted friend, and therefore we've been happy to see them undertake projects in the Northeast, which is very sensitive for various reasons. It's politically sensitive and in security terms. There are concerns we have, and also strategic areas such as the Andaman and the Nicobars, where also I think Japan is the first country which has set up ODA projects there. So there is this very strong trust factor as far as India is concerned. Now, of course, this is not only to be seen in the bilateral context, but also in the wider Indo-Pacific context. And, that what we can do with our bilateral relationship, but also the countries, our own relationships with ASEAN. Because I think both Japan and India have a great stake in the ASEAN region. So this bilateral relationship that we have, starting from the Northeast, the Andamans, the economic development along what we call the Bay of Bengal, this is something that will have benefits not only for us, but also beyond in strengthening the Indo-Pacific region. In fact, when you talk about the Northeast, I just want to talk about two projects. They've done a lot of work in the Northeast, but recently our Prime Minister, I think it was perhaps sometime late last year, had laid the foundation stone of the longest bridge ever over the Brahmaputra, which will connect Dhubri in Assam with a place called Phulbari in Meghalaya. The importance of this is that it will reduce the distance between these two places as of now, which is 250 kilometers to 19 kilometers. You see, connectivity intra the states in the Northeast is also very poor. And this is where I think Japan is helping us a lot in connecting our Northeast together. So connectivity is not only beyond borders, but within. And the second area is the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where they have a Japanese company has built India's first submarine optical fiber cable system, which covers, from Chennai to the islands, some 2,300 kilometers. And as I mentioned, the first ODA project ever that was on renewable energy has also been established here. But this optic fiber system, you can imagine how it will help in connectivity between India and the very strategically placed Andaman Nicobar Islands. With this, I think I would talk about something that I think Professor Girish Kumar had mentioned to me also, that the interest that we have in the economic relationship. So the political relationship is doing very well. The security and defense relationship is progressing. We can have some satisfaction out of it. Infrastructure development, again, is probably, we can take and say that is something positive. But one area where I think there has not been adequate progress, certainly, is in the area of investment and trade. Now, what is the rationale for this? This is complementing the very complementarities between our economies have been a very key driver of this relationship. Very often we thought that, when they relooked at India in 2000, they also relooked at it because India was emerging as the largest market after China. And therefore, that was one of the probably drivers for this reset in our relationship. So there is no doubt that the lure of the growing heft of the Indian market and Japan's financial and technological capacities have been a very important consideration. We signed a CEPA, which is called a Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which was an FTA between our two countries in 2011 to boost trade and investment. However, it has not lived up to its expectations. I happened to be in Japan at the time that it entered into force, and we had great hopes of what this would deliver. But what really happened was that it briefly, our trade figures, they increased and then they fell. Whole set of factors, as also did FDI. So this is an area where I think much has to be done, and we have to go beyond good intent and rhetoric and make sure, because this is where it can make a difference in the relationship. So bilateral trade, just for figures, which I think gives you an indication, was a mere 17 billion in 2019-20. It might have gone up a little bit in the last year. I don't have the figures. And it accounted for just about 0.7, India accounted for just 0.7% of Japanese imports. The trade balance also had been widening over the years after CEPA in Japan's favor, hugely in Japan's favor. That is from about 3.54 in 2010-11 to almost 8 billion in 2018-19, and maybe more now. The expectations from the CEPA are therefore still to be realized. The reasons for this are various. I mean, one is that I think Japan tends to be an extremely difficult, if difficult in terms of opening up its economy to imports from outside. And you would have read a lot of stories about the problems that there were in the US-Japan relationship on the trade and economic front. And I think that is what also besets us. So where there are very clear complementarities that one could see, but one was in the pharma area, because, they said that they would go majorly into generics because they had an aging population, and they have a huge domestic market, which is about $87 billion, but they still tend to rely more on Europe and the US and the West rather than on India. It's just about 1% of the market is what we have. And I was reading an ICRIER study, which was of 2020, which said that Japan had raised 64 non-tariff barriers against our main export projects. One major export from India has been marine products, where Kerala has a big role to play. And there also, I think, that the growth has been stymied. It's been a steady part of our exports, but I know that while I was there, it said that there were a lot of problems because of non-tariff barriers that had been raised by Japan. Second area that one looks at very obviously is really the IT sector, because the world is recognizing India's IT prowess. And Japan is talking about need for digitization. But on the other hand, we don't find the big contracts that Indian IT companies are getting in the US or Europe. We don't see those in Japan. There are the number of reasons for this. One of it is, of course, that I was always told with that Japan only outsources about 10% of its IT needs, and of that 10% of its IT needs, 50% is done from China because of geographical proximity and therefore same time zones. Also, they use the same kanji, they use the same characters, so it's easier for them to be able to work with China rather than Japan, than India. And this is something that we have been trying to do. I think the reason is that fundamentally, I mean, we really got to transcend these impediments that are there. And what are the impediments in trade and investment? I think these are regulations. Both of us have bureaucracies that don't really allow progress, which we know. There are systems which are different. There's also perceptions. I think Japan hasn't really come around to think of India as a country that can export high tech. Or, there is still that kind of mindset which we have to get around. And in all honesty, I must say, Indian exports in all parts of the world, we still are hampered by inconsistent quality. So this is in terms of really trade. FDI, overall, I think Japan is in the first 5 in terms of FDI into India. And about 34 billion has been the FDI into India from Japan since 2000. However, we compare very, very poorly. I mean, with the ASEAN, compared with China, and right now, I don't want to, say that, okay, the number of companies have grown from 200 to 1,500 or whatever. But the point is, given the size of India, the potential of India, this is one relationship which really, really, this is one part of the relationship which we need to really focus on. There are several sectors that I think that has potential, and some of those are the automotive. I must tell you about Suzuki. The Suzuki, if you want, India is the largest market for Suzuki cars. It has also, India is responsible for over 50% of its the profits of Suzuki Corporation. So we have a very important role to play insofar as Japanese automotive makers are concerned, automobile makers are concerned. So we need to see them come in a bigger way. Again, electronics, electronic systems, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices, I think, is something where India has a huge market. Textiles, food processing, these are some of the identified areas. And I think these are things that we need to focus on. Hopefully, this will be done. And now, both sides have been conscious, and they've set up something called the India-Japan Industrial Competitiveness Partnership, which is led by ministers, and they try to look at what are the issues and how can we resolve the challenges of the specific sectors. Again, in some areas where Japan has tried to really seriously help India, this is to set up 12 Japanese industrial parks. industrial townships in India. Now, why is this? Because what we found was that Japan was very comfortable. Japanese companies want to work in their own ecosystems. We found this. We looked at why were they going in such large numbers into Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries. Why were they in China? And we found there was a question of, they want to work in a sort of culturally more comfortable ecosystem, and that this sort of these Japanese industrial parks helped that. So we first started off one very close to Delhi in a place called Nimrana, but this has been now replicated, and there are about 12 industrial parks. And this has been a good pull factor for Japanese companies to come, and maybe we should have much more. These have fairly developed infrastructure and also special incentive packages so that, we can attract Japanese companies. The other thing is, very strangely, and when Japanese companies, when I was there, that I heard Japanese companies saying, oh, we have a problem of getting employable people in India. And initially, I must say that as an Indian ambassador, I was a little, taken aback, because we keep saying that we have the second or third largest pool of skilled people in India. So what do you mean by saying that we don't have employable people? And later we realized that there was a need to upskill people in India at different levels, and also to be able to match whatever the requirements of the Japanese companies were. So since then, we have encouraged them to do so, and Japanese companies and the Japanese government have now set up 13 India-Japan Institutes of Manufacturing. And there are specialized courses that are there where Japan, and what happens with these courses is wonderful, because of course it trains our students and they can be picked up by Japanese companies. It encourages Japanese companies to come. But on the other hand, it of course skills our people, our students, for the rest of the market also. A new area of our collaboration, which I must mention, I think I've more or less covered a lot of areas, and this is to do with the startup ecosystem. Because I think the Japanese suddenly realized that, that there was a lot of entrepreneurial and, innovation in India, which they had not noticed. So they have come up, they set up a startup hub in Bangalore. They didn't want to be kind of left out of this. And what is very interesting is that their PE and their VC companies in India now have been funding our startups, and of about 30 unicorns that were there in the last year or so, almost about 12 or 13 of them have been funded by Japan. This is a great area of interest to them, and this is probably, again, one of these new, the new frontiers of our relationship. There are two other, very quickly, I talked about frontier technologies. There are a lot of frontier technologies, and, it's being done bilaterally. We have identified areas such as space, cyber, a whole list of areas where we can work together. And we're also working in the context of the Quad. As you know, that there is a group in the Quad which deals with critical and emerging technologies. So we're looking at 5G technologies, IoT, AI, the whole works. So I think cooperation in so far as frontier technology is concerned has become a very important part of our relationship. And now, after this maturing, if I may say, of our relationship, India and Japan feel confident and comfortable with each other to say, okay, what can we do together in third countries? And this has been a new element of our relationship. Again, there is much to be done, but we started off by looking at projects in Myanmar. Myanmar is in trouble now, but we had looked at some housing projects in Rakhine. As you know, that was an area of problems where the Rohingyas came in Myanmar. We looked at projects related to the rail sector in Bangladesh. In Sri Lanka, there was something to do with LNG, and Africa. So Africa is going to be this new frontier area where we hope that Japan and India can work together. And we have seen synergies, and our strengths are such that we can complement each other. So we hope that the next step will be for India and Japan to work together in third countries. So, as I said, it's a very exhaustive agenda. There is a lot happening in our relationship. One area perhaps that I haven't mentioned, and I would just mention in passing, then wait for your questions, and that is to do with people-to-people exchanges. Because for people, there is a positive perception on both sides. There have been various kinds of, I think both sides have gone out, and there have been reports to say that generally that both countries, people at the popular level, have a very good sentiments towards each other. But this needs to be sustained and this needs to be deepened. And I'll tell you why. Because one of the things I noticed when I was ambassador in Japan was that Bangladesh and Nepal had more students in Japan than India did. Of course, China far outstripped us. Now, what was this and what was the need for this? And I must tell you, education in Japan is a very high level. I think because there's a lack of information in India, certainly. Maybe because we are more English language, dependent, but also there's a lack of awareness. So there are a lot of areas where we've got to develop understanding fundamentally at the level of people. We're trying to do that. Tourism was hit a bit by what happened with COVID, but I think there are educational exchanges and generally more youth exchanges and studies on each other's histories. I think there's a lot that we can do in improving our people-to-people exchanges and understanding. So this, in a way, is, I think, I've tried to touch on the main aspects of the spectrum of India-Japan relationships. It is a very, very important relationship. And I think we've got to work. It's still at the level, I think, somewhere in some areas, particularly in the economic areas, in the area of potential. We have to realize the potential. And with those few words, I think I will end. And I really look forward to questions. Thank you very much.